Crunch time again for Russia as the latest set of US sanctions kick in today, this time over the March nerve agent attack in Britain against a former Russian spy and his daughter. The sanctions will terminate American aid to Russia and some arms sales, but also deny Russia credit and prohibit the export of security technologies. Russia denies involvement in the poisoning of the Skripals and says the new sanctions will only increase tensions between Moscow and Washington.
And these sanctions will be bolstered by new penalties in 90 days, unless, of course, Russia gives reliable assurances that it will not use chemical weapons and will allow international inspections of its facilities, something that the Kremlin has been very clear so far it is not interested in doing. Joining us in Moscow, Ivan Nechepurenko, New York Times correspondent, and with us in Washington, Stephen Blank, a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council in D.C. Stephen, let me start with you. Big picture, these sanctions, we heard when they were first announced a sort of tit for tat, Russia slamming them, saying they would retaliate. What kind of practical impact, if any, do you think they're going to have?
The sanctions have a very strong impact because they are sanctions on the raising of capital. They will affect Russian businesses, particularly energy companies. They also are sanctions directed at the Russian arms export, which is a major sector of the Russian economy in getting foreign capital. And they will affect, therefore, the banking sector as well, because banks that lend money to Russia become vulnerable to U.S. sanctions. And what we also have seen is that the sanctions that have already been enacted are having a significant impact. So these sanctions will add to that and certainly have a major impact on the Russian economy over time.
Ivan, let's go to you now. We're hearing some chest thumping from senior Russian legislators, one lawmaker even threatening to consider moving tactical nuclear weapons into Syria. But how could Russia really react to this latest round of sanctions?
Well, that's the biggest problem, that economically there isn't much Russia can do. There isn't much trade with the U.S. Russia is not really supplying gas or oil to the U.S. So, of course, the only way to retaliate is kind of asymmetrical political retaliation or military retaliation or diplomatic retaliation. This is what Russia has on the table. But so far, the Kremlin has been cautious because, as you've mentioned in your report, the second round of sanctions will only be announced in 90 days. So the Kremlin today, a Kremlin spokesman said that they're going to wait to see what the real effect of these restrictions will be.
Okay, well, Stephen, let me ask you, the Americans have been placing a set of sanctions on sanctions against Russia. Is there any evidence to suggest that this is having a positive effect at all and actually forcing the Kremlin to rethink its behavior?
Well, that's an open question. I think it's been very clear that the Kremlin wants to get out of the sanctions, and that's one of the reasons that has driven them to try to make overtures to the Trump administration. But they're trying to make overtures to the Trump administration without giving away anything tangible, whether it's Syria or Ukraine or anything else. So there's a little bit of impact in that sense, but fundamentally they have not yet decided to make the gestures necessary to relieve the sanctions.
Ivan, if we're talking about financial pressure with sanctions, that's one thing. But when the Kremlin is looking at this administration and mixed messages being sent throughout, still not 100% clear where Russia policy comes from. We see different messages on Trump's Twitter feed than we hear from the State Department. What does that do to impact how seriously Vladimir Putin really takes these measures?
Well, of course, Putin is having his fourth term in the Kremlin. He has more than 5 years to go, and the economy has been stagnating for his third term for the last 5 years, and people's incomes haven't been rising. So he's looking for ways to relieve the Russian economy of sanctions. And I think the main thing he will do is he will try to make deal with the Europeans, with Germany in particular. He just went to Germany recently, and I think they are not really hoping that the US will produce much, because they think that Trump is a hostage of the political situation, and even if he wants to, he won't be able to deliver on Russia.
Stephen, on exactly that, Ivan just mentioned actually countries being driven to do business with each other. That is one thing we've seen consistently throughout this administration, is sort of strange bedfellows coming together to try to ink new deals because of issues with the Trump administration. Could the sanctions actually be pushing new relationships that could harm Washington at the end of the day?
Well, the sanctions may have that impact, but they're not really new relationships. The Russo-German relationship is actually decades, if not centuries old. It just got worse after Ukraine and Syria. The Russo-Chinese relationship is also a generation or so in the making. So the turn by Moscow to China and to the Chinese market and to the Chinese financing is also something that was actually underway even before the invasion of Ukraine, but has accelerated. So there is certainly that impact. But, you know, nobody wants to run afoul of American banks. So even Germany and China will be cautious. Deutsche Bank in London, for example, just told the Russians that they have to conform to British banking laws and so forth, or they're going to stop doing business with them. And just 2 years ago, Deutsche Bank was fined a lot of money for arranging loans from Russia and doing all kinds of illegal services. So even turning to other states is a limited capability here.
Ivan, let's ask you, we're saying there's no evidence to suggest that Russia is really rethinking its behavior, but then what will? How hard do the sanctions need to bite for the Kremlin to do that fundamental strategic rethink?
Well, the Russian economy is fundamentally based on the exports of raw materials, on the exports of crude oil, oil products, gasoline, gas, metals. If you take away that, this is going to bite. But I don't think that this is even on the table now, because the European market is heavily dependent on Russian gas and Russian energy and other resources. They're just building another pipeline to Germany actually right now. So I think we're really far away from that. But I think what is going to happen is that the Russian economy is going to kind of enter the permanent stagnation mode, and this is going to bite Putin politically in the long term.
Okay, well, Stephen, if indeed this is the case, and it doesn't appear that the American pressure is going to force Russia to change its behavior, what realistically are the Kremlinologists in Washington expecting to come of these sanctions and the entire strategy of snapping sanctions on Russia?
Well, there are a lot of Kremlinologists here, and I can't speak for everybody. But I think that many of us believe that sanctions are only part of what needs to be the effective strategy. We also have a military strategy of rebuilding NATO and deploying troops in the Baltic states. And obviously we're trying to bring about a Syrian outcome that is somewhat different than what Moscow wants. So all those things are in play as well. I'm less pessimistic. I think over time these sanctions will help force a change in Russian behavior, because it's not only the stagnation that will come about, but it will also be more difficult for Russia to compete economically, even in the energy sector, because of the shortage of capital that's coming. And what's more, the administration is bringing about a lot of pressure on Eastern Europe and Central Europe and Germany to buy energy from other sources. And I would not rule out that they have some success.
Stephen, briefly, in the less than a minute we have left, we spoke to you early on in the Trump administration. You were critical, certainly, of the Kremlin's behavior. What do you think your report card on Trump policy on Russia so far?
Well, you only have half a policy, because as you mentioned, you have Trump saying one thing and the government doing another. And what the government is doing is not yet really a complete strategy, although I think they are the right moves in terms of replying to Russian aggression in Crimea and to things like the chemical attacks in Great Britain and in Syria. So, you know, it's an incomplete.
All right. And incomplete also on how Russia will react and if it will live up to those demands within the next 90 days.